The Sermon on the Mount has been life-changing for me. We're done with that now, but it was life-changing from the simple standpoint that Jesus was revealing how he wants us to live. And it's something that passes down through the decades and centuries and millennia. And it comes to me today, it comes to us today on how he wants us to view one another, to be with one another, to exist in our world to his glory. And the people heard that and they were amazed. They were more amazed when last week we discussed how a centurion's faith was so amazing that Jesus turned to the crowds and said, this is a primo illustration of what I was talking about on the Sermon on the Mount. Those are my words, of course. He didn't say that, but he simply said, I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. And this was from a Gentile. So we had that experience, and I'm grateful for that. What we move on today, and if you downloaded the notes via Zoom, by the way, I thought I had sent you only the one sheet, but when somebody printed it out here, they said that they also got my brain, all the notes that I write for myself. And next time I guess I'll be more careful. You don't need to print out all my brain. It's information, but it has Greek words and German and so on and so forth. So anyway, sorry if you printed it out and it's like, man, I got 10 pages. How many did you get? You should have only got 2, but anyway, be that as it may. So the first page, the title really is Death Meets Life. Death Meets Life. I thought that was a catchy title. Death Meets Life. Sometimes I just surprise myself. I'm kidding. The second sheet was actually how I started. Jesus raises a widow's son from the dead. That's the nuts and bolts of what happened. So with that title, or with those titles rather, you get the idea of what the story's going to be, and we've already read it, so you already know what's going to happen. But it begins with, again, Luke writes with words that I don't see in other places, and so it starts out really, and it came to pass the next. It's like, okay, so what do we do with that? Well, Luke has this ability to, not ability, it's, you see it in the Christmas story, and it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus. Well, it's Luke's way of telling us that in the course of what I'm telling you, and that would be addressed to Theophilus, I am bringing the story along. I'm moving the story along. And so down the road from what I previously shared, it came to pass this next thing. And it's literally the next thing. It's they finished up with Capernaum, and it says, and it came about soon afterwards, is how we read it in the New American Standard, but it's the next. In fact, some translations actually say the day after. So if it's the day after, it's the next thing that happens. Jesus is going to take a little journey, and he's going to go to Nain. And since you all are very familiar with Nain, I won't say anything more about it. So, and that's a joke because nobody knows anything about Nain. In fact, it's supposed to be about 20 miles south of Capernaum, or rather southwest, because if you go south, 20 miles south of Capernaum, I think you'll be in the Sea of Galilee. But anyway, southwest of Capernaum, and it's about 5 miles north of the Samarian border. It's the southern part of Galilee. It's supposed to be near Mount somebody. Anyway, you can read it somewhere in the notes there. And Nain is nothing. This is the only place it's mentioned. If it wasn't for this story, Nain would be a non-entity, a non sequitur. So it came about the next that he went to a city called Nain. All right, there you go. And his disciples were going along with him, that is, they were accompanying him, and there was a large crowd accompanying him as well. So you see the movement. Jesus on his way to a place called Nain, because we're going to find that the story as it progresses, he's going to be heading toward the city gate. I was thinking about the 12. It's 20 miles, and if you could walk 20 miles an hour, it would have taken him an hour to get from Capernaum. Okay, again, being facetious. If you walked fast, 5 miles an hour, it'd be 4 hours. And probably due to the nature of, you can't, 20 miles this way doesn't mean 20 miles. It probably means 25. So probably wasn't 4 hours, probably something to the effect of 6 hours. So if he left Capernaum at 6 in the morning, he's approaching Nain noonish. Work that however you want. There's no time frame in this. But he's not going alone. Jesus is a phenomenon. People look at him and they are amazed. What just happened? Well, a slave was healed. Well, what just happened before that? Well, there was this unbelievable sermon on the mountain. Well, what happened before that? And you keep going back. It's like he's a phenomenon. So not only does he have his 12, what I call the boys, going with him now. So you'd have Jesus at the front, and then behind him would be the supporting row of the 12. They're going to be as close as possible to learn all they can from him as he gives dribbles of wisdom as they walk along. And then behind them, and it's hard to know what a great multitude is. I'm going to say a minimum of a couple hundred people. A great multitude would not be another 12. So there was a total of 24 people on this journey. I'm going to say there was a minimum of a couple hundred people. And potentially even more than that. And so it almost becomes unwieldy, but Jesus isn't there for the crowd. He is there for his 12 and to accomplish something in the way of God's plan. So we get to verse 12. Now, as he approached the portal or the gate of the city, behold. So what we're going to see here is if we take Jesus and his group coming from the north, east, coming this way, and just for the sake of argument, we're going to say that Nain is facing north, northeast, whatever. And so you have the gate of the city, the main gate of the city, looking northeast. And so what's going to happen is this. There's going to be a movement to where something's going to hit right here, with Jesus at the very front, and then we'll discuss what's on the very front of that coming out of Nain. So as he approaches the portal, the gate of the city, behold, and that's always a Greek way or the writer's way of saying, this is what's going to happen. So this is not a take a breath, but I'm going to tell you, behold, take a look at this. This is what is going to happen. There was being carried out one dead. So the one dead is written in the perfect tense, and that's the way it's always written in the Greek. It's a verb, and yet it's treated like a noun. So we talk about a dead man or a dead one. In the perfect tense, that means that he was dead and he continues in that condition. You're not dead today and then tomorrow it's like you're going to 7-Eleven for a Slurpee. You're done. So the one dead was being carried out. Now, what do we know about this dead one? Well, first of all, he was dead. Okay, everybody knows that. If he wasn't dead, there wouldn't have been a procession for a dead man. Secondly, he was a son. Okay, well, most of us guys are sons. No, all of us guys are sons. But in this case, he was an only begotten son. Now, what does that mean? Well, it wasn't that he was the only living son. He was the only child. He was the only one born to his mother and father. So he was a son, he was only begotten to his mother, and what else do we know? Well, we know that his mother was a widow. So we don't know how long Dad's been dead, but she's already done this once. And the losing of a spouse, I saw what it did to my mother. Can't say that there's anything good about it. When you lose your spouse, you've lost something big. So she's already lost something big. And it hurts. But my mother had 5 children, and they all went and visited her from time to time. And they all took her out to eat, and they all took her to the doctor, and they all, for me, I was always the one that would go buy the rock salt for her water softener. And then I would clean the cat thingy, whatever the cat thingy's called, because we don't have a cat. So I would clean the cat thingy for her and take the stuff out. And so those are things we did for my mother. So my mother had some, how do you say, relief after Dad's passing. She never lost any of her children. I don't know what it is to lose a child. We had 2 and we've still got 2. But this gal has lost the only one that could that could give her any help or sustenance or succor in her living, in her existence. He would be the one she would count on to take care of her. And now at this time, and then the reason I'm drawing attention to this is that Luke gives us the picture of the pathos of this event. And we can't catch it if the only thing said was there was a dead guy and Jesus showed up. We get the whole picture. Plus the fact that it says there was a large crowd, a goodly crowd, a sizable crowd of the city was with her. So the procession would have, and with the beer being toted, by the way, it is beer. B-I-E-R is beer. For those of you who thought it was Bayer, it's not Bayer, it's beer. And yes, I'm mentioning beer from the pulpit, but it's B-I-E-R. So the beer, I'll explain that in a moment, would have been carried, and the mourner, that is the parents or the children, would have been either in front of it or behind it. And because of the way this plays out in the story, I believe that the mother was in the lead. So she was in the lead, followed by the guys who would be carrying the body, followed by a large crowd. And you think about, if this was a beggar woman, how many people do you think would have been following the bier? She couldn't have paid anybody if she was a beggar woman. So there would have been nobody following the bier. It would have been her and whoever was dead. And she would have had to have hired people just to carry the dead body. So either the husband had been somebody of importance and she was living off that sustenance, or the son had been coming into his own, and so he was a young whatever, ready to take over certain things. We don't know. It says they were with her. Well, they wouldn't have been with the dead body. The dead body was a part of the procession, so the real person they would have been supporting would have been the mother. So she had to have been somebody that was at least what you'd call the middle class to upper. But if you go upper than that, then you start getting into government jobs, and that's a whole different story. So we don't go there. So probably somebody in the middle class who we don't know anything more than that. So what we see now is out of the city gates, a woman weeping openly, followed by a body wrapped on a bier, carried by perhaps friends. And then behind that, the city filtering out through the gate. Well, coming into or up to the city is Jesus, who would have been at the front, followed by the 12, followed by the minimum of 200, and there would have been this meeting. We get to verse 13. And when the Lord saw her, he was filled with compassion. Now there's a couple things here, and one I did not draw attention to in the notes at all. In fact, it wasn't until a little later that I said, my goodness, I missed it entirely. It's the word the Lord, or the two words the Lord. And when the Lord saw her, Luke now will begin to call Jesus the Lord. And I just wanted to read, for those of you who did print out the notes, it'll be on the second column on the back under verse 13. It is to be noted that Luke uses ha kurios, or the Lord, to designate Jesus. He will do so again frequently. This designation had its beginnings during the earthly life of Jesus and developed rapidly into a fixed usage after his resurrection. It is this usage that we see in Luke. It designates Jesus as the divine Lord and ruler who is over all, and in a special sense, namely as the divine Messiah, over all believers. It is not intended as the personal name of God, the equivalent of Yahweh from the Old Testament, for it designates Jesus in his office of ruler. But it always designates him in his deity as our Messiah ruler in whom we trust, whom we obey, who is the source of our salvation, and whom we worship. It may be that Luke begins this use of, quote, the Lord, because of the greatness of this miracle. But what's going to happen from now on is you'll see that, yes, Jesus is still mentioned because that's his name, but Luke will begin to refer to him as the Lord. And so we see here in verse 13 that he says, and when the Lord saw her. So we begin to, we see now that the transition into that will become common in the book of Luke. But we also see something else, and that's that he was filled with compassion. And again, if you back yourself out and say, why was Jesus leaving Capernaum to go to Nain, a no place? Why? Well, when it's all said and done, I believe it was for this very specific instance. And we could say it just happened that this funeral was taking place at this time, just happened. You have to understand that due to the nature of the climate and the lack of a good mortuaries, that if he had died in the night, if the young man had died in the night, he would have been buried by the afternoon. If he died in the afternoon, then he would have been buried in the morning. So you had to take care of the body, you wrap it up in cloths, get a bier to put it on. That would be 2 poles usually with slats across. They'd lay the body on, and then they'd either carry it on their shoulders or they'd carry it, on the side. Either way, there's no indication of how he was carried. So we'll leave it there. You can choose up here in the shoulder or down along the next to the hips. But he sees he sees the mother, he sees what's going on, and he has compassion. And in a sense, it's inexplicable how he could so quickly assimilate all of this. He would not have had time to pass it and to go into the crowd and say, what's going on? Who is this? Who's the woman? He assessed this as only Jesus could as he approached and saw this happening. He was filled with compassion. And he says something to her. he says, and you can take it, weep not, do not weep, stop sobbing. I translated it as stop wailing. It's, of course, the shedding of tears, but it's also audible weeping. So whether she was wailing in the sense of keening or simply sobbing, as isn't quite keening, but nevertheless, he comes up to her, and it's a command, and it's stop weeping. Now, we don't stop there because there is no Selah in this. And by Selah, I mean from the Old Testament, a pause. What happens here, what transpires between 13 and 15 is almost like one swift movement. They approach from Nain, Jesus, he sees it, he assesses it, he comes up to the woman, he looks at her. You can imagine, and I have a hard time with this, but you can try to imagine Jesus looking at your face, and yes, you've got tears, and yes, you're sobbing, and this man looks at you and says, stop weeping. And it's hard to say it in a voice that exudes all the compassion that Jesus would have had. And by the very look in his face, she would have assessed that there was something here, something different. And Jesus doesn't stop. That's the thing. He comes up to her, he is in her face, and he says, stop weeping. But he doesn't stay there and hold her hand and comfort her or give explanation. He just keeps moving past her to the bier. And so we see in verse 14, and having come forward, he touched the bier. The New American Standard unfortunately says coffin. Yes, it could be. The only thing is that the Jews didn't use coffins. So I'm not sure why the New American Standard did that. Maybe for us Western readers, because we bury people in coffins, or when they're burned, they put them in urns. This wasn't an urn; it was a bier. The body was wrapped up on a platform. And so Jesus, passing the mother after telling her to stop weeping, moves up to the bier and touches it. Now it doesn't say hold it, stop, like holding it, like he grabs it so everybody kind of jolts to a stop. He comes up and touches the bier, and all those that are holding it stop. Now keep in mind, the guys are following the woman, and the woman stops at the command of Jesus to stop weeping. He moves, so they would have, and he comes up. This is the place where the activity is going to be. Weird word when it comes to a dead person, but that's where all the activity is going to be. And he puts his hand on the bier, so they stop, and now something amazing happens. And he said, very short, young man, to thee I say, rise up. Now tomorrow morning we're going to get up early, and we're going to be on the road. We haven't decided whether it's 3 in the morning or 4. I'm much better off at 4 in the morning than I am at 3. And I may set my alarm, but even if I do, there's somebody in the household who will come and say something to the effect of, hey, time to get up. I'll have to decide who that is, but Kathy will come and say something to the effect of, wake up, get up, time to get up. That's in essence what Jesus is saying. The word is interesting. It's to arouse, it's to awaken. Of course, then we also use it to raise from the dead. But Jesus isn't saying raise up from the dead, and it's passive, and it's a command, and it's to the effect of be arousing yourself or be awakened. So Jesus is addressing this young man as if he is asleep. I guarantee you he was dead. Everyone there knew he was dead. His mother, believe me, would not be burying him if she thought he was just sleeping. Wouldn't be a very good plan. So Jesus says, young man, and notice a couple things here. He says, to thee I say. Young man, to thee I say. Did he know his name? Well, I mean, roughly we could say yes, he knew his name, but from the encounter coming down from Capernaum and coming out of the city gate, he didn't stop to get all the information, his social security number and so on and so forth. He didn't know his name. He only knew that he was a young man. And consider this too, that Jesus was probably 31. So to call somebody a young man, he didn't say boy, so he's not 12. He's somewhere between 13 and say 20 years old. So somewhere in there is this young man. And he addresses him very specifically, young man. And he says, I say to thee. We cannot pass that up. Number one, figure where they are in relation to Nain. Yes, they just came out the city gate, but how close is Boot Hill? Boot Hill is not miles away. The cemetery, the graveyard is probably within shouting distance. So can you imagine Jesus just standing there without directing any commands? And he says, rise up. All of a sudden everybody looks and everything over in the graveyard is moving because everybody there just woke up. It's like, ah. Jesus is very specific. Remember Lazarus? If Jesus hadn't shouted, Lazarus, rise up, or come forth. If he had just said, come forth, all the graveyard, everybody would have been out. It's like, oh man, shouldn't have happened that way. It didn't happen that way. He's addressing just this young dead man. And we can't overlook the words I say. Keep in mind that the words of Jesus have power. The words of Jesus have power. We need to pay attention to his words. And the words of Jesus coming from who he is as Emmanuel, God with us. He says, be awakened. So, what happens? I was going to play the music from one of the things. Dun, 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 dun. You know, everybody's tapping their toe and the flies come buzzing and it's like, everybody's watching what's happening. No! That's not what happens. And the dead one sat up and began to speak. Now stop and think about that. So here he is, he's dead. Jesus says, be aroused, be awakened. The guy does. Now have you ever woken up and your sheets are all around you? You start to wiggle and say, oh, I gotta lift up my bottom, lift up my legs, get my shoulder. Anyway, he sits up. And I thought about why it says, and he began to speak. And it's different than, again, it's different than we typically read. It's the start. He's starting. That's what the began means. It's different than some of the, well, you can see the translation in Lenski in verse 16, they began to glorify. That's one word. This is a separate word. So he gets up and the first thing he does is he starts to talk. Well, if you woke up wrapped in linens, covered with all sorts of herbs and spices, don't you think you'd have something to say? Like, get this off of me? Mom! He began to speak. There was no question that this young dead man was alive. By this time, as he sat up, I imagine that the guys holding the beer would have put the beer on the ground. I don't think they kept holding it because now he's moving. A dead person doesn't move, so you have something easy. But a guy that's moving, it's a little hard to keep him on there. So they had probably put it down, and the next thing we see, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Now, that is one of those gifts that keeps on giving. Jesus said, "Be awakened." The guy awoke. He said, "Get these things off of me." What? I don't know what he said. And when he finally was stripped down, probably to where he had his arms, I'm sure they didn't strip the rest of him off. Somebody, I'm sure, gave him a robe. But he stood up, and I'm pretty sure Mom and the son would have hugged. Jesus took him and presented him to his mother, who probably was like all of us would be. There is a result here, and it's verse 16. Fear took them all. Yeah. I think the 12 would have been standing there with their mouths open. The 200, the whole city. Everybody would have been standing there pretty amazed. The beauty here is that they began to glorify God. And I'm going to say this before I read what they said. They fell short. A great prophet did rise up among us. Sounds good. Is it true? Is Jesus a prophet? Yeah. But not if you're thinking in terms of like Isaiah and Elijah and Elisha and Jeremiah and so on. Those guys were just prophets. They were men God chose to minister. If that's all they're looking at Jesus as, yes, it's like a cut above the rest of us, but it falls way short of who he actually was. The second thing, God did look upon his people. Now you can see in the King James it says he's visited his people. Or the New American Standard, God has visited his people. That word visit isn't like somebody comes in and says, "Hey everybody, good to see y'all. Sorry I can't stay for church, gotta run," and they take off. Not that kind of visit. The visit of God is for the benefit of his people. And we found that in Matthew 25, where God judges between the left and the right, between the goats and the sheep. And he said, "I was in prison and you visited me." Well, again, it's not just showing up and looking through the bars and saying, "Hey, how you doing in there? It's good to see you." It was that they visited for the benefit of that person who is alone, locked away, and they maybe bring a cloak or something to read or whatever the prisoner might have, but it's from the person themselves for the benefit of the other. And then James tells us in chapter 1, verse 27, that we are to visit the orphans and widows in their distress. Well, that doesn't, again, it's not like knocking on their door and saying, "Hi, I just wanted to let you know I'm your neighbor, good to see you." No, it's the visitation with the concept of helping them. It's bringing shoes for the orphan. It's bringing some bread and milk and butter for the widow who can then feed herself and her family. That's the concept. So the idea is that God has done this for the benefit of his people, and we're so grateful. But again, it falls short of looking at Jesus as who he really is. When it says there went out this word, this account concerning him into the whole of Judea and all the surrounding area, Galilee, at the southern part of Galilee, all Judea would have been Galilee, Samaria, and Judea would have been the whole In our case, it wasn't just the 5 cities area, it was the whole Central Coast from, say, Monterey down to Santa Barbara. So it would have been not just Galilee, not just Samaria, not just Judea, but the whole. And the account was the whole account here. How Jesus had shown up, how he spoke, how a dead man was raised to life. We look at this, and it's not so much that we would be surprised that Jesus raised a dead person from unto life. A dead person meets life. They meet Jesus, the Prince of Life, the giver of life, the gift and the giver. We have that story. We go a little further in conclusion just to make sure that we always look at Jesus in the light of who he really is. We should never ever be satisfied with just he's a good man, or he's a child, he's the Christmas child, or a great physician. He is indeed all those things, but he is God encased in flesh, Emmanuel, God with us. And he came for this period of time to swat flies and sweat. I mean, I talked with Kathy before we got here. This was probably a 6-hour journey anyway. And did Jesus have to go to the bathroom with a large crowd following? And you kind of go, good grief, God the Son. No privacy, no me time. What he accomplished for us just because he loved us. And we meet this one small story, and we don't know what happens to these people. We don't know. Eventually they died, just as all these people eventually died. But we know that he understood and he had compassion in a very hard situation. And he took care of business. And he takes care of business in our own hearts too. He knows our hearts. He knows our needs. He knows our shortcomings. He knows our fears. He knows all those things. He cares. He cares. So today, make sure you look at your Savior as, in this case, I'm going to close this way. He is the King, and he's coming soon. Be ready to meet him with arms open wide. Father, we want to remind ourselves to give ourselves to you in these difficult days. We don't know if there's more difficult days to come. That's not our call. It's all in your time. But Father, as far as how we treat each day, that is our call. And Lord, may we be your people in every sense of the word, and may we follow you closely and dearly and nearly, so that when you come and you have asked the question, will the Son of Man find faith when he returns, you can look at us and say, yes, I did. So, Father, as we depart now, Kathy and I, for the next 3 Sundays, and then we'll be back a 4th Sunday, you have a plan for each of us. And I pray that you would watch over each of us separately as we go our own ways and do our own things. But may you bless this church as they continue to serve you wherever they are. We pray these things in the name of the Master. Amen.